happy to answer questions.
You mentioned demographic changes. Recently, marriage rates and birth rates have gone to a new low. And do you see in
recently marriage
rates and
yes.
birth rates have gone to a new low? Do you see in the future SAF reversing NS policy of extending maybe NS liability, NS cycles, and by then, where do you think the 3G SAF is going to be?
Well, our projections for the next decade are fairly stable because if you look at our demography, our own births, I mean, yes, we can't predict what happens 20 years later. And I don't want to, it's a theoretical aspect, but for the next decade or so, 1988 we had a dragon year, if I use that as a marker, and then a year 2000 was a mini dragon. The next dragon year is 2012, right? But if you project that forward, because they're 18 years old to 21 years old when they're enrolled, so I think it's quite steady. It's going to be less than 1988 when we had a fairly robust dragon, 50 over 1,000 births. And we've responded to these changes in terms of using technology. And that's why I talked about the frigates. If you talk about the old technology or the old way of thinking, a frigate of that complexity will require 2 to 3 times. And even in other navies, they're still using that kind of manpower. But we've responded to that in using technology to multiply our efforts. So I would say that it's not a significant constraint at this point of time. Really, we want to maximize each individual, and we need to have the commitment and how we utilize our human resource is the more important challenge, not the numbers at this point of time.
Kim Seong from Zaobao. Because the new cabinet change and there's a lot of ministry review and we look into all the policies and there are new policies come up from other ministries. So is MINDEF also reviewing some policies that is staying trying a new look or new approach?
Whether you must always constantly look at your policies to make sure that they're relevant to your challenges. But you're not reviewing policies for reviewing's sake. You have to ask yourself, what are your challenges? And that is why I think it was I wanted to sketch out that we continue to be vulnerable. No matter how you re-look or want to review your policy, we're a small country with a small population. And 2, your external environment. Can Singapore influence the external environment to the large extent? So you have to adapt. And our defense needs, the fundamentals is by sketch if we have to defend ourselves, because nobody will come to our rescue. We can't and don't want to defend ourselves. The external environment, we know roughly the direction, roughly the forces, but the minor episodes you can never tell. You can't predict, for example, even the HADR tsunami. For other countries, the Mumbai attacks were devastating for India, and we had to learn from it very quickly. We are no less vulnerable than Mumbai in terms of your geography or in terms of a threat. And recently the conflicts around it, whether it's potential conflicts on the Korean Peninsula or the South China Sea, tell us that you cannot take the position that, only when I see the threats will I start to prepare for my defense needs. Because it took us 15 years from the time to decide on the new platform to replace our missile gunboats, frigates, to operationalize it, to have full operational capability, to buy the right platform, integrate the systems, train our men. So it's a very long time frame, and our policy, which I don't think will change, is that we have to continue investments. NS is a critical lever. I talked about what we says, but in between the other aspects of training, how to engage NS men, what the new needs are. We must always adapt our methods. The policies and fundamentals, the policies are sound because the fundamentals can't change. But each new generation is different, and you have to find new ways of engaging them and getting Singaporeans to be committed to the affairs, explaining to them. And we'll try in different ways, whether it's use of social media and if you look at the BMT, the recruits, which I ran with just now. Previously, your dialogue sessions, if you plan an hour of dialogue sessions, after, you run out of things to say before the dialogue session ends. But commanders are telling me now, our young have many views, and I think that's a good thing. How do you tap into it? How do you get them to, they're used to growing up in their environment, and they share their views. But you've got to get them to internalize their own, reach a consensus, find their own conclusions. So I would say the basic policies are sound because they address the fundamentals. But in terms of your methods and your processes, that must continually be looked at to make sure that it remains relevant to the current generation as well as to our current challenges.
Maybe then, Sir Jonathan Straits, you can tell us some of these methods or processes that can be re-looked, given that you are dealing with a better educated and more questioning servicemen and the changing face of the world.
There's been very deep thinking going on in SAF commanders. And they've understood, and the deep thinking in the sense, let me give you just one example. They looked at how even, not just from a micro level, but how society has changed from an industrial age. I saw one of their slides that the BMTC shared, how we move from industrial age to really a knowledge-driven economy. So you have different systems and processes. And how even learning has changed. From one where previously the teacher was the authority and the repository of knowledge. That's no longer be true anymore. To one of what they call social constructivism, these terms. Which means that you learn in a group, your facts are all there, you can really search it for yourself. Your teacher directs you, but you have to come to certain fact-finding and conclusions on your own. Now, to me, that's quite deep because that's happening in schools too. And I'm glad that as I see both systems, how the SAF is not falling behind and trying to keep up with this. And terms like problem-based learning, facilitated dialogues, facilitated learning using LearnNet, which we show you, online learning, are visible signs that SAF is keeping up and trying to really grab the bull by the horns. It's a new bull, a more vigorous bull, quite a vocal one too, and trying to say, well, let's take the new environment as it is, but how do we have the right outcomes? And the outcomes cannot change, which is, how do you continue to remain committed defense? How do you continue to raise an SAF that is dominantly or critically dependent on NS men? Because they are the fighting force to be operationally ready. I mean, that continues to be the goal. But the route there may be different. So if you look at BMT itself, how it's changed from, I don't know when you did your NS. Parents who come here. Sometimes now we've got into the third generation, where grandfather did NS, but mostly still second generation. Some who have never come to BMT, the fathers come and their response is, how come your mattress is so thick? My time the mattress was 1/3 or half of and why are your shoes so well padded? How come you have playrooms that, because the old mentality was, the philosophy was you break down to build up. You actually want to find a breaking point, then you can build up. But in the new generation, we decided the philosophy was really, when you train very hard. When you rest to recuperate. And then you use physical science. If you look at the instructors that were even leading the run just now, I don't know whether you were here. How many of you were here just now? Even the warm-up exercises were completely different from what I did. It's a new science. Previously, we were taught to stretch like mad, on the ground, rolling and tearing our limbs. Now it's sort of just sustained, no over repetitions. So that's I'm cheered by that, because I was in school athletics and our warm-up exercises were completely different. We stretch much more and much harder. But the new science, as I've been following, is now we're not even sure whether warm-up is needed or useful. But at least, you have people who are professionals looking into this. So I'm giving some examples of how we have to change the environment. And what you see today are really visible, the external and the infrastructure are really visible representations or expressions that there's been deep thinking and deep change. But we have to do more because the new generation is growing and we have to continue to find just different ways to engage them but still reach the right outcomes that we want.
Maybe from what you've seen so far, how else do you think you do more?
I think it's a continuous journey. And in this, we are quite at the front edge of the envelope because we are among the few armed forces that require NS men because of our own constraints. And we have to allow some experimentation for the commanders. In other words, we don't have many people to learn from. Many of our needs are unique. Singaporeans are unique now. We have to find our own way, and I think we want to give the commander some latitude to try. Some will work, some don't. It's got to be both, from the top down. I can paint to you the challenges, the policy, the vulnerabilities, but when you deal with men, you have 100 to 200 men in front of you. You've got to have thinking commanders. So, I remember my son who finished NS recently, when he did BMT, he said he had a NS commander, this was a sergeant, who thought that his way of engaging, and by the way, he was a graduate from Oxford or something, one PPE, but he decided that the way to build commitment was to read them newspapers on foreign affairs. So when he came back and told me that, I looked, okay, try different ways, because he was dealing with a well-educated BMT, and he wanted to explain to them how the world was changing, what our vulnerabilities are. So he took up the newspaper. I better be careful. I don't know which newspaper it is, but it must be our local newspaper. And then he opened up and says, this is what happened here, this is what happened here, and what your feedback is. In my time, it was unthinkable, right? It's unthinkable. But you have both well-educated commanders and NS men, and you've got to engage them differently, but still have the right outcomes. So I think you need to sort of ground up initiatives. So